Good morning, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Weed Control for Low Maintenance Roughs and Natural Areas, presented by PBI Gordon and taught by J. McCurdy, Ph.D. My name is Lisa Wick. I'm the Senior Manager of E-Learning Programs here at GCSAA and will moderate today's webinar. You will have access to the recording that we're now making as part of the follow-up email. Your audio is muted in this system, but we do encourage you to ask questions as we go along. And you can do that by clicking the raise hand button on the GoToWebinar control panel, and I can unmute you. Or you can also type questions in the question answer box. If your control panel has minimized, there is a thin strip with an orange rectangle at the top. If you click on that, the panel will expand. Today's session is eligible for 0.1 GCSA education points. At the end of the program, we'll provide you with a code that you can use in the association's website. We hope that you'll find today's webinar valuable. It's brought to us in partnership with PBI Gordon. With a full line of herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, growth regulators, and other products, PBI Gordon Corporation is a national leader in the professional turf and ornamental management industry. From proven favorites like the Trimec line of broadleaf herbicides to innovative products like new Tekken broad-spectrum fungicide, PBI Gordon delivers performance and service that pros have counted on for 70 years. Today's webinar is taught by J. McCurdy, who's an assistant professor and extension specialist at Mississippi State University. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Tennessee Martin, master's from the University of Tennessee Knoxville, and his Ph.D. from Auburn University. He currently serves as an academic liaison for Louisiana Mississippi GCSA, is an active advisor for the Mississippi Turfgrass Association, and has taught both seminars and webinars for GCSAA. Please join me in welcoming today's presenter, J. McCurdy, Ph.D. Jay?
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for having me. You did a great job. I am pleased to share with you today some things that we're working on at Mississippi State. There are others in the United States working on similar problems, and I'll give some credit to them as we go along the way. First and foremost, I want to credit my colleague, Jared Hoyle. Lisa, can you advance for me? Jared is who I have been delivering some of this material with at GCSAA over the past couple of years. Jared's an assistant professor at Kansas State, and so I appreciate his contributions and contributions of others. So I want to really briefly run through some of our thinking, our philosophy about why we're using roughs. We'll talk briefly about establishment, because I think establishment, material selection, those get you a long ways towards weed-free native grass roughs or native or natural areas. So first and foremost, those things are I think something we have to focus on. We learn as we go, and certainly we find that some of these blends, some of these mixtures give us better results than others, and certain establishment methods do as well. So we're thinking golf course rough, golf's modern focus as evidenced by statewide BMP plans, by national BMP management plan put together by GCSAA. All of these things are focused on sustainability, and one of those sustainability BMPs is to reduce the total area under maintenance. We've been doing this a long time because of cost and inputs, and it's just a renewed focus on some of the same things we've been doing. These environmental, economic, sustainability efforts have led to increased interest in native systems, albeit I think sometimes we use native a little bit too loosely, so I'll talk briefly about that. But essentially our goals are ecology, playability, and I think aesthetics. Sometimes those orders shift depending upon who you are, where you are, and what your goals are. So first, ecological succession. This is something we've all got to think about no matter where we are in the United States or around the world maintaining golf courses. Those areas that we are maintaining as turf, they are such because we have inputs such as mowing, perhaps fertility, pesticides in some instances. And if you stop mowing over time, what would occur is a natural succession towards dominant canopy, whatever that may be. In the southeast, that would be deciduous forest in combination with in some cases pine land, depending upon soil type, soil acidity. Wherever you go across the world, there is a natural succession, a progression towards that native dominant canopy. Sometimes there's invasive species that take advantage of that open canopy. Sometimes there's no longer tree cover or natural or native species that will reinvade those areas. Certainly those things do happen. But in the end, we are battling succession, sometimes more successfully than others. Native golf course rough, this is really a loose term. I refer to these as natural areas. Sometimes we're not using native species, but typically they occur in different structures. Those structures, scenarios, if you will, they are from one end of the spectrum, a native grass rough. Typically we think of these as those wispy grasses, forbs. They're still playable if they're thinned periodically throughout the year. You can still find a ball in some instances, some you can't. Woodland margins, these are more diverse areas, less playable. They either are in or out of play. And then we have native woodlands. Native woodlands should not be discounted as being native or natural areas. These are typically unplayable unless they're mulched, cleared of limbs and debris. Most likely they are out of play on many of our golf courses. I would know. Okay, so plant material selection. Plant material selection is important, and so we're going to take a participant poll, and we want to ask about, okay, what are we doing here? Lisa, guide me.
Sorry, I was
There we go.
answering an email for someone having trouble getting in.
So we want to know, for curiosity's sake, do you have natural areas on your golf course? Choose all of them that apply. You don't have to choose just one. Notice that there's xeric or desert shrublands. For those of you in the desert Southwest, you're going to have probably some instances where there's just native shrubs.
And closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2. And
great. Yeah, tall grass roughs dominate. I'm glad that you have woodland margins. Probably many of you have tall grass roughs that I guess progresses up to or into those woodland margins. Natural woodlands, great.
And we have a couple of comments. I'm looking to establish no-mow areas now, looking for wildflowers, etc. So
yeah, we're going to talk about those. So stay focused. Here we go. All right. So native species selection, since the majority of you are interested in native roughs, wildlife area, forbs, if you will. We'll talk about those very briefly, and then I'll head on into weed control. So native species, these are species, back up. These are species that are
Jay,
that existed. Yes.
Weren't we doing 2 polls here?
Did you see another poll?
Well, I have another one.
Let's do it.
You have several, and I thought these 2 were going together because it's kind of a follow-up.
Yeah, I recall that we had 2.
Okay.
Okay, if you have natural grass roughs, what species predominate? So this could be fine fescue, tall fescue, Bermuda grass. Could they be native warm season grasses like broomsedge or bluestem or switchgrass? Native cool season grasses, these are typically Virginia or Canadian wild rye. There are other cool season grasses. And you can only select one because of that word predominate. I'm surprised that some of those numbers are so low. I'm actually surprised that fine fescue is not higher, but that's great. It's good to know that we're not just a fine fescue clientele. Great, Lisa. Thank you. So these native species, native warm season grasses, cool season grasses, they typically existed prior to European settlement. Let me drag over something and share with you on the screen. What you might be able to see is that there are websites such as USDA Plants. USDA Plants, that's what this website is, hosted by NRCS, allows you to search for something like fescue. And then in a certain color, it's going to demonstrate to you where it is native. So this is a fine fescue, Festuca rubra, native to, say, Canada. In our example on the screen here, you can see that bushy bluestem, for example, is native to much of the southern region of the United States. I would say south of the transition zone in most instances. There are also naturalized species. So those naturalized species, back up, these are not native to a certain area. They do continue to reproduce. They maintain themselves. Pennisedums, the fountain grasses, are some of those that are naturalized. So I think it's really a point that is worth making when we are talking to our stakeholders, whether they be owners or architects or players. We need to make sure they understand that we refer to these areas as naturalized areas unless they have native grasses in them that predominate. So then you start saying they're native areas. Here's an example of pollinator habitat. This is probably one of the most common included in our pollinator habitat blends, our seeded blends. This is Indian blanket, and you typically include this with a bunch of other stuff. It happens to be native in much of the Southeast as well. Native grasses, here's a list. I won't go into a lot of detail and read these off, but there is a list that is shared with you, much the same as here in the two handouts that I've shared with you. Lisa, I think those are up. If not, then we can get those up.
They are absolutely in the control panel. They can download those.
Great. There's non-native grasses. We include fine fescues. Typically, we don't think of these as being native to the United States, although there's an argument that they might be native to some parts of Canada. You go down the list and you can see some of those annual and perennial ryegrass that are not native to the United States. Now, if you go to a European golf course or you go to the UK, you're going to find many of these growing somewhat naturalized. Arguably, they made their way to that island by movement of people as forage, but that's neither here nor there. So here's an example of a successful use of broomsedge and bluestem. In fact, this is mostly bluestem in the picture you see here, little bluestem to be exact, and this is Capital City Club in Atlanta, Georgia, maintained by Kyle Marshall. I think he does a great job. I respect what he's done here, and he continues to do some renovations and install more of these areas. On the other end of the spectrum is something that's a bit more rangy looking perhaps, but nonetheless is a native type of rough. This is the Preserve Golf Club managed by Stephen Miles down in Vancleave, Mississippi, which is near the Gulf. He's got wiregrass, so some of the tall wispy material here is actually wiregrass. You can see bushy bluestem, and you can also see this is prairie cordgrass, Spartina. There's actually a number of different Spartinas on this course. Stephen also manages some areas that are out of play that are native pitcher plants. These Aristolocaceae are rare, and they're these old salt flats, so that's an example of native types of roughs. It's in the midst of a big preserve. Okay, so I think that now, well, here's an example of some weeping lovegrass, which is actually in a woodland margin setting. This is Jed Spencer's golf course, Chenal Country Club up in Little Rock, Arkansas. So establishment and maintenance is hugely important in getting these things to be a dense enough stand to compete with weeds. I don't want to go into too much detail about fall versus spring seeding, other than to say that basically your cool season plants, think for instance fine fescues or tall fescues, you would typically plant them what time of year? In the fall. All right, you plant them in the fall because that's when conditions are ready for them, that are ripe for them. When would you plant Bermuda grass or centipede grass or a warm season grass? In the spring. So you plant in the spring for a warm season grass, in the fall typically for a cool season grass. There are folks who will fall seed warm season grasses. Those fall seeded grasses typically will not germinate, but you get a really good incorporation of the seed into the soil because of frost freeze action, heaving of some of those soils. You get natural rainfall that buries them. Spring seeding typically is better for native warm season grasses than fall, in our opinion here at Mississippi, but that may differ depending upon your region. So be guided by some basic agronomic principles and you should be okay. Drill seeders are typically used to establish these types of grasses. So native seed drills, which I'll show you pictures of in a minute, are really important to establishing these areas. If you're using native grasses, if you're using anything that has an awn on it or requires multiple different types of seed to be drilled simultaneously, you typically would want to use a native seed drill. They have multiple bins. They have a lot of options for controlling seed output and manipulating what your rates are. Plants, you can do these directly into stubble, which is essentially no-till, which is great on highly erodible banks and surfaces that you may not be able to till. Common manufacturers, here are some examples, there are others. You can use drop seeders. These are great for sowing turf and pasture with high rates of regular sized and shaped seed. But for throwing seed, the type that we have that are typically distributed by wind or rain or by fire, those awns on those seed, they don't allow it to distribute very well out of spin seeders or wigwag seeders like we use for spreading fertilizer. You do need different agitators for native seed, depending upon what type of drop seeder you're using. These work best in cultivated seed beds, and that goes without saying. I'll try to show you some pictures of some of those native seed drills. This is an expensive drill. There's no doubt about it, but there are seed drills out there that have small seed boxes. Typically, you would use this for legume seeding. You might use some of these other boxes for awned or tufted types of seed. This is a food plot drill for those of us who have a small tractor with a 3-point hitch. These are great. One thing you would notice is there are often variations on drills that allow one-pass seeding. So you can see that this has some disc blades on the front for ripping up and loosening the soil, followed by a seed spiker on a roller, and then you've got behind it a harrow that's going to allow you to press those seed down into the soil. So good seed to soil contact goes without saying.
Okay, that was the question I had, Jay, on that.
Okay.
So the slit goes first, then the seed goes in, and then the roller over the back end, what does it do?
I would call it a press wheel or a harrow. Excuse me, not a harrow, a roller. So that roller is just going to basically seat the seed down into the soil, slightly compact the soil so
hold it in place a little bit better.
Less prone to erosion. These make a lot of sense when you're drilling into established material like you would for food plots. So if you're going out and planting a deer plot or a turkey plot, whatever, these make a lot of sense. In the types of areas that we're planting, I think oftentimes we're able to go in and prepare the soil, and we don't always need this type of aggressive tillage in front of it. You use what you've got. There's no reason why this wouldn't work. It's got 2 seed boxes, so it probably would work just fine. I don't want to spend too much time on seeders. Most of us have drop seeders. These are in fence rows all across the country. They're useful for seeding a lot of seed that don't have awns on them. It's really hard to get a native warm season or cool season grass to pass through a drop seeder like that. It's a brilliant. There are other makes as well. Broadcast seeders don't work all that well. In fact, we typically think about having to increase our seeding rates by about 25 to 50% using native grasses just because we have a seed that doesn't get incorporated into the soil. Unless you can use something like this harrow. This is actually a roller harrow, and it's got, you can see some curved tines here that you can manipulate to raise or lower. That would be the harrow part, and then you've got a roller that would compact that seed and give you a firm seed bed. So that's an example of the type of tool you could use for large acreage areas. There's a number of different rollers and harrows out there that you could choose from. No-till planting, typically it's done with a seed drill, a native seed drill preferably. About 1/4 inch is the preferred depth for seeding many of these native species. You think about how they have evolved. They've evolved to be planted fairly shallow. Typically they're blown with the wind and they settle on the soil. Natural frost freeze action incorporates them, and then the next year's crop pops up. Very few natives like to be planted deeper than a half-inch, and quite a few do well on the surface. So the surface of a well-prepared seed bed, yes. The surface of something dominated by a fescue or Bermuda grass, it's going to be very difficult to get established. So broadcast seeding, it's okay on tilled soil. You got to go back and cultipack or roll prior to seeding as well as afterwards. You typically need to have a 10 to 25% increase in seeding rates if you're going to do this. That doesn't sound all that scary until you start talking about it. You know, sometimes your seed is 10 pounds per acre, and it may be $150 to $200 seed per acre cost. So, you know, it gets expensive pretty quick if you're having to increase. I encourage folks to go out and see if they can borrow a native seed drill. A lot of our NRCS offices, our local natural resources conservation offices, will have a native seed drill in this part of the country that you can borrow and pay a pretty small per acre cost. So that's something to explore in your area. Hydroseeders, these make a lot of sense. If you've ever used one, they make a mess and they don't always work. You got to prepare the area. On a slope like this on a golf course, you'd be better off going in and vegetatively propagating plugs rather than actually hydroseeding, because you almost have to double seed rates. You have to double these seed rates because there's actually baffles and mixers inside of this tank, and it destroys a lot of the seed. So you gotta think about that. Can you afford to do that? And there's folks that can and do. It does work. I won't say it doesn't. Okay, this is mulch back up here. This is mulch. Makes a lot of sense. We are all agronomists. We think about mulching as a way of retaining soil moisture, preventing weeds. It did, and we did some research, and it doesn't work. So you basically got no mulch, pine straw, wheat straw, hardwood mulch, hydroseed, and then you've got a germ blanket. Which one do you think worked the best, Lisa? Which one?
I'm going with the hydro seed.
Boom.
Oh.
It actually worked the poorest. And this was not actually even mixed in a hydro seeder. This was mixed by hand in 5-gallon buckets. And try getting green material off of your hands after you've done that. But regardless, that tackifier doesn't always allow us to have better germination. I would generally steer you away from wheat straw, because wheat straw is not always weed-free, and also wheat straw has some allelopathic effects, which means it's releasing some natural chemicals. So I would steer you towards no mulch if you can, or possibly using light pine straw, maybe hardwood, but whatever you use, you've got to keep it pretty light in order for it to germinate through.
If you do use a mulch or something, then you have to deal with getting it back up, right? So if it doesn't really work that well...
I don't know that you've got to get it back up. If you seed lightly, most of that stuff is going to mineralize over time and release nutrients. Most folks wouldn't go back in and remove it. We could talk about that all day long, but mulch as little as possible, only where you need it. So what are some keys for successful planting? I'm going to interject some of these FAQs here as we go. Start weed-free. I'll tell you more about this later. Put down Roundup as many times as you can to kill existing material. That's the best thing you can do for weed control. Prepare a good seed bed when slope allows. Plant shallow, no more than a half-inch deep, and then firm the seed bed afterwards. That's going to give you better seed-to-soil contact. It's also going to give you a bit better surface that isn't quite as eroded by water and wind. Some alternative methods for establishment that I'll mention briefly. We've done some work using herbicides to transition Bermuda grass with native populations of Broomsedge and Bluestem. We actually were trying to kill Broomsedge, and we couldn't do it. So nothing other than MSMA really kills Broomsedge. I'll make this point very quickly. If you're using Broomsedge and there comes a time when we don't have MSMA, remember I said this, it's hard to control in Bermuda grass. So always have your pre-emergence herbicides down if you are trying to prevent it occurring in Bermuda. So anyway, we sprayed a bunch of herbicides, and actually what we find over time in some instances, we release Broomsedge. One of the key herbicides we use for releasing Broomsedge in cool season grasses as well as Bermuda grass is actually Plateau, a mazapic. I'll talk more about it in just a few minutes. You can establish vegetatively. You can take a cup cutter, you can take a post hole digger, tree spade, whatever you would like, and you can plant these things. It doesn't take a genius to realize that it is labor intensive, but it is certainly, with most native warm season grasses, a very viable option, and I see it being used more and more. especially in small areas or areas that are perhaps highly visible where you've got to establish really quickly. A lot of these native grasses don't establish very quickly. So we will talk a bit about some other methods, but weed vegetation control, that's where I want to spend the rest of the time today, Lisa. So an integrated approach is required, not only focusing on establishment and material selection, but also you got to focus on, you got to focus on other things that we need to do to maintain these native areas, particularly native grasses, pine lands, and woodlands. So burning, typically most of our species of native warm season grasses are very tolerant of burning. I don't know how altogether practical it is for burning. I think we may have a questionnaire on that in just a minute. Tillage, you're going to have to go out and hand till, possibly use a hoe or a shovel to remove weeds. Mulching is sometimes an issue or something you should do. Mowing, hand weeding, these are all things that we have to do and be prepared to do if we're going to maintain these areas weed free. This happened last time. I think it. Do I have? Oh, thank you. Thank you. So hand weeding, realistically, this isn't always possible. It's labor intensive. It's highly effective though. So if you've got clumps of things that you are spot spraying with Roundup, in a lot of instances, you'd be better go out with a handsaw or a hatchet or a shovel and remove it. And it's going to take persistence. But over time, developing a pretty lush and dense stand of any of these grasses in these naturalized areas, including the fine and hard fescues, it becomes more competitive with a lot of the weeds that we would typically be battling. Burning, this destroys weed seed. It reduces disease and insect pests. It improves vigor of a lot of our native species. Arguably, it doesn't really improve fine fescue all that much. It probably shouldn't be done in many of our fescues, to be honest, unless it's in the right types of scenarios. A participant poll. All right, Lisa, carry on. I want to know how real. Sorry, Lisa.
No, I was just going to ask you a question. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask, how realistic would burning be on your course? Not realistic at all. I'll never be able to burn. Somewhat realistic, I might be able to burn small areas, or very realistic, I can burn every year. Burn, baby, burn.
So you just mentioned that maybe with fescues you don't need to really burn.
Yeah, I don't know. There's other resources on fescue management and burning. It depends a lot upon when it dries out. So here's the thing. As you go further north and you get into these fescue areas, they're doing great in the springtime. Right now, arguably, they could be a little, worse for the wear. But as the temperature gets right, they're going to do really well. By summertime, when we have all of our great season for golf, it's really hard to go out and light a fire to all that beautiful wispy fescue. So from a practical standpoint, not an agronomic standpoint, we don't typically see these areas burned. We see them mown or mowed. I have seen fescue burned. I know that Joe Kennedy at the Legends Club in Franklin, Tennessee, he has burned areas before, and those areas turn out great. That doesn't always mean it's something that your membership or folks who play your course want to see. All right, what do we got? Not realistic at all, and nothing about that surprises me. That doesn't. It should, if anything, that should confirm to most of you that it's not really something most folks are doing. It's somewhat realistic for some folks, and there's probably isolated instances where you've got to do it here or there just to get a good dense stand of native grasses. So burn early rather than late. Typically, this is in the spring. For us in the southeast, we're going to start having some drier weather, and that stuff gets dry really quickly with some of our spring winds. You got to be careful not to, allow it to escape and get out of control, but certainly we do it this time of year. Swathing the area down with a sickle bar mower or a barrel mower, drum mower like we use for cutting hay, allows you to get that material down closer to the soil, and when it's laying down closer to the soil, you get higher temperatures and you get a longer period of burn, and that allows us to kill a lot more weed seed. So laying that senesced tissue down for fuel by mowing or rolling is something that we advise. It's not always practical either.
So there is this question in the Q&A box: can burning promote weed seed to germinate?
Depends what weeds you have. If you've got native warm season grasses already, like broomsedge and bluestem, bushy bluestem, that are just naturally part of the landscape, yeah, you're going to probably start to steer towards those native vegetation. You know, if you've got a fescue area that has even the slightest invasion by broomsedge, bluestem, yeah, it's gonna favor those native warm season grasses.
And he has typed in that he has sunflowers and pot.
Pot? You got pot on your course?
You know, there are places where the railroad, you know, it got planted here in Kansas. I thought that happened across. But yeah, that's what he's indicating.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't know what to do about your ditchweed. You know, I don't know. I don't have a lot of experience with marijuana growing. So I'm not on that
thought
list.
That was another revenue source. No, that's not.
Yeah. Not for me, even though I'm a weed scientist.
There's another question here quickly. What is your thought on adding annual rye at seeding?
I don't like it because we can't get rid of annual ryegrass south of the Mason-Dixon line. Annual ryegrass has so much resistance to our ALS inhibiting herbicides and to Roundup that if you choose the wrong variety or just wind up being unlucky, you may have annual ryegrass that persists for years. And it actually has some allelopathy, and it'll crowd out a lot of things that we try to establish. Now, annual ryegrass, in my experience, doesn't do all that well as we get up into northern latitudes as we get really hard freezes. I could be wrong about that, but really hard freezes typically take out a lot of annual ryegrass north of us here. We're going to talk about some cover crops. Give me a second, and I'll make a mention of that. I don't want to move too slowly because I want to talk about herbicides because that's really a major focus in my research, as well as most of us are interested in that. When to burn, warm and cool season grasses. The idea is to mimic natural burning. This usually occurs when material is dry and dormant. For warm season grasses, that is almost always, you know, middle of winter through early spring. Burn it before you start to get young green tissue popping up, and you're going to get a real solid break in new material. It releases new material, in fact. For cool season grasses, I don't know. Whenever it's dry and you can burn it, that's the best I know. Middle of winter or early spring is common for all of them. It just depends where you are. So mowing, this is more typical in cool season types of scenarios where you have fescues, especially dense stands. We recommend across the board, every specialist is going to recommend something like 8+ inches mowing height, a bush hog or a hay mower, a flail mower, barrel mower. Those are the types of implements we use to mow these areas. You can use a rotary mower, but you could burn up belts and clutches and all kinds of things. You typically want something pretty robust. Cool season grasses, 1 to 2 times per year, I think is fairly common. For warm season grasses, typically no more than once per year, and we don't always mow our areas. The denser they get, sometimes over time they crowd each other out and they become more clump forming. So broomsedge, bluestem, they start to form these clumps, which actually make it easier to find balls and you know, to get in and access for hand weeding, so on and so forth. Material removal. So mowing, it is favoring the grasses because the growing point of those grasses are down below your mowing height, whereas those broadleaf weeds, I think about your brambles, blackberry, raspberry in some parts. I think about nettles. You also would want to think about young trees or saplings, sweet gums particularly problematic here. Any of those that you go in and you mow once per year, you're mowing the top growing meristem off of them. Now, sometimes they can reemerge and they come back even more vigorous than they were when you mowed them. But then you got to get rid of all that material that you've mowed off. There's not a better method of doing that than hay baling. That simultaneously thins the stand. It removes a lot of that verdure or that material left behind, the tissue. Issues that you're going to face. I grew up on a farm. No one wants to buy your fescue after it's had a seed head produced. No one really wants tall fescue hay to feed their horses or cattle due to endophyte toxicosis. And also, a lot of times you're harvesting it while it's so green and dry that it sets folks' barns on fire. So good luck finding someone to buy the material, but so I guess there's sometimes a market for the material. You can probably give it away. Frequently asked questions, should I fertilize my native areas? Almost always, probably not. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't be amending the soils prior to establishment for phosphorus and potassium if they're needed according to a soil test. But nitrogen, typically, we don't want to amend these soils with any kind of supplemental nitrogen. It's going to increase weed pressure. The crabgrass, the goosegrass, the quackgrass, Johnson grass, those are going to be problems in any of these native stands, wherever you are, as long as you have rainfall. However, I think the exception would be adjusting soil pH. So adjust soil pH is necessary according to soil tests. And I'll make a moment, or take a moment here to say irrigation is also part of the problem. You don't want to over irrigate these areas. In fact, the fine fescues, they will not do well if over irrigated. They do much better in dry types of scenarios. So that's actually some of the advice I would give you on the fescues. Chemical weed control. All right, take it away, Lisa.
Okay, here we go.
What weeds are you facing? And I know this isn't an exhaustive list, but choose all of them that apply. And if you've got some others that you're facing, please put that in the chat box and Lisa can inform me about those.
Jay, do you want to guess what your number one answer is going to be here?
It's gotta be Bermuda grass or crabgrass, but I guarantee you some of y'all put broadleaf weeds. I'm gonna tell you how easy it is to control broadleaf weeds here in a minute. Broadleaf weeds, it was a toss-up, really. Broadleaf weeds, we're going to get rid of broadleaf weeds. You got the budget, you can spray broadleaf herbicides on all these grasses, but that's good to hear. It confirms my suspicion. Okay, so weed control, again, it's a combination of factors. Mike Goatley says this pretty frequently. I've seen his articles written multiple times, but first and foremost, you got to be an agronomist. You got to understand the life cycle of plant species. If it's a Virginia buttonweed and it's reproducing during the summer, that's when you got to spray it. If it's a broadleaf weed species like clover, it's a perennial. It's not spreading by a seed, so control it as a perennial. Natural ecosystems of plant material, pick the right material for your scenario. If you're trying to grow fine fescue in a bunch of lowland areas that are saturated all the time, it ain't gonna work. What are your expectations? Yours as well as your stakeholders. There's just some instances where native grasses and native woodlands don't work. Sometimes, we got to rethink some of these things. Longer, short term, yeah, that should be self-explanatory. What are your expectations? Do you have some patience? Pre or post herbicide options. So pre-herbicides are going to affect emergence from seed of any number of things, both weed species as well as desired plant material. Sensitivities, every grass is going to have some sensitivities. Reestablishment restrictions, if you're trying to reseed into areas or you're allowing them to reseed, that could be an issue. Ease of application, costs, those are all things that you should consider.
And I'm going to interject here. Vasty grass and thistle are two of the other big weed problems.
Yeah, and we can talk about those. Bull thistle in particular is a really hard weed to control in tall and fine fescue. We'll talk about some options. If you'll bear with me, I'll talk about them and try to remind me here in just a second. Vasty grass, I'll lump it in with Johnson grass, so we'll talk about it briefly as well. Weed control during establishment. Some pro tips. If you're battling weeds now that were there when you started, well, you got to rethink those areas next time you do them. You got to go in, establish from the get-go some kind of routine of applying Roundup the summer before. So you got to take those areas out. Oftentimes we're allowing them to fallow for a summer, allow them to be dry. Bermuda grass in particular, if you can spray it 2 or 3 times between March, April, May, and then allow it to summer fallow and make one more application prior to fall or spring seeding, you get great results. There are some other things we can do as well. At least one application of glyphosate within 1 week prior to planting. So just don't be afraid to do it. In fact, I would even say if you got to, go in there a day or two before and make an application with glyphosate right before you drill seed into it. That's better than nothing. Okay, there are programs, and there are programs that work sometimes better than others. Most of the programs are for cool season scenarios, and that's just because of the dominance of fine fescue, tall fescue, hard fescue, creeping red fescue. Those are dominant species in most of our large Gulf markets. Atlantic seaboard, up there near Chicago, all you guys that are kind of more northern. You got great programs out there, and they work. I don't want to say that weed control in fine fescue is any easier than weed control in native grasses, but you've got a lot more herbicides available to you. It gets pricey. So as you can imagine, Dow's program is going to be heavily dependent upon their materials that they have, Confront being one of them, Dimension. So Dithiopyr is used as a pre. Typically in northern climates, you get 8 to 12 weeks of control. Further you come south, you may not get quite the length of control. And that's going to give you control of crabgrass and some goosegrass and some broadleaves. But altogether, it's not going to give you post-emergence control of some of the larger materials. Confront, on the other hand, is a pretty good material for controlling thistle. You've got other options. You need to look at labels and make sure you can use them on courses. One of them is Crossbow, which is 2,4-D, and I believe triclopyr or clopyralid. Gallery, this is isoxaben. Gallery is going to give you broadleaf weed control and no grassy weed control. So Gallery is isoxaben. It's commonly used in combination with other things that control grasses. So Gallery plus trifluralin is Snapshot. Gallery plus pendimethalin or Barricade. Those are other commercially available products. So BASF has a program. Their program is, it does include indiangrass and bluestem. This is going to be relying upon their materials. So they've got, strangely enough, they've got Barricade, Dimension, or their product, Pendulum AquaCap, at a full rate prior to grass termination. You could apply this in the spring this time of year and get crabgrass and goosegrass control. And then you're coming back with summer applications of Drive, Acclaim, Tenacity, Pilex. All of those are labeled in your cool season types of scenarios. We've done research with Drive and Segment and found it typically is well tolerated by a lot of our native warm season grasses in addition to Indian grass, so Broomsedge, Bluestem, but I think it's one of those things that you want to try on your own. Mow or burn areas. They actually advise you to mow or burn and then apply a pre at full rate. I don't think there's anything wrong with any of these programs. You've got to figure out what works for you. And again, just like on your course, you're relying upon a pre-emergence herbicide and then post-emergence applications of what escapes. That's really what you're trying to do with any of these programs. We've even used indaziflam or Specticle in a lot of our native warm season grasses. Keep in mind, Specticle and indaziflam, it's not labeled in cool season turf. It probably won't be in cool season native or naturalized areas just because of phytotoxicity issues. We've used the granular, the flowable, and even a total product, which is diquat and Roundup included with indaziflam for both post-activity and pre-control. I'll show you some pictures of that in just a minute. Some pro tips. Are pre-emergence herbicides right for you? During establishment, you've got to weigh the potential that you're going to have some plant mortality if you put a yellow herbicide or a photosystem 2 inhibiting herbicides, maybe even Gallery, over the top of quarter-inch planted plants. I'm going to steer you towards a couple of herbicides, so bear with me just a second. But you got to think about this. I probably wouldn't go put Barricade and Pendulum over the top of seed yet to germinate, unless it was a particular scenario using native warm season grasses, and even then you've got some better options. Okay, so general things to think about. Non-selectives make multiple applications. You can use this on dormant warm season grasses. As long as the plant material is dormant, you can spray it. You can use low volume applications over the top of dormant material that may have some green tissue down in the canopy and you can get some control of some of the taller material. Broadleaf herbicides like triclopyr, clopyralid, 2,4-D dicamba, MCPP, MCPA, all those products, including haloxapine methyl, which we'll talk about in a minute, Arylex, we'll talk about it. They can be used when grasses are the desired, can be used when grasses are the desired vegetation, but they will kill broadleaves and forbs, such as your pollinator habitat. So establishing pollinator habitat within these grasses means that you're either going to allow it to be a mixture, or you're going to have pockets of just forbs and just grasses, but it's really hard to control a lot of broadleaf weeds in these broadleaf pockets of forbs or in combination with grasses. Sedgehammer, that's halosulfuron, so does Prosedge, Defender, Floragelam, Certainty. All of these are safe on various warm and cool season grasses. Certainty's got a kind of new label, so I think they took some of the cool season grasses off the Certainty label, so make sure you're following label directions. Okay, for native warm season grasses, particularly bluestems, indiangrass, side oats, grama, and broomsedge to some extent, Plateau or a Mazapic is applied prior to planting and has some pre-activity. So what you would do is you would go in, prepare your seed bed, apply this material, and then drill seed into it. I'll show you in a second that we've actually made applications of Plateau over the top of yet to germinate bluestem, so that works relatively well. It works relatively well for broomsedge as well. Bluestem, switchgrass, or eastern gamma grass, the Certainty label actually does include recommendations for those particular grasses. And I say this because most of us are contemplating, in the Southeast, most of us are contemplating how these bluestems and broomsedge, how they fit in. They fit in really well if you can spray Plateau over them. If you have other stuff that you're trying to keep, such as Bermuda grass or fescues in those areas, Plateau smokes it. So that's not always something you want to do if you don't have a plan to go back and reestablish those natives. Little bluestem, side oats, I'm going to show you some pictures. We put Roundup down twice prior to our establishment. After seeding, we applied Plateau, directly after seeding. We didn't irrigate, we didn't do anything. We put Plateau over the top of immediately after seeded broomsedge and bluestem. Once you establish, you can actually use Drive, Atrazine, Sedgehammer, Plateau at low rates to control a lot of weeds. Here's an example where we've drill seeded. You can see that's a 1/4 inch planted, Lisa, and we didn't even get good cover of those seed, and yet we got really good establishment. And I'll show you what this looks like when you make a Plateau application over the top of that. Some of you may think that's not really good establishment, but keep in mind when we're seeding at these low rates, a lot of that bluestem, you want it to be clumpy. You actually want it to shoot up and bolt in its first year. If you got too dense of a stand, it won't. Likewise, if you've got a lot of Bermuda grass or crabgrass, it also won't bolt in its first year, and you don't get quite the aesthetic appeal. So in native warm season grasses, we push Plateau, and that's what everybody's trying to compete with. So we've done research with Specticle. I want to show you just briefly my thoughts on using any pre in combination with post-emergence non-selective herbicides. So here you've got Specticle flow plus Roundup, granular Specticle, and then a Roundup, and then you've got Specticle Total, which is a liquid applied. It's got diquat and glyphosate. So essentially, as long as you put this material out when the material is dormant, you don't have a problem. But if you put out anything with Roundup or other non-selectives in over the top of these non-dormant natives, yeah, you're going to have some issues. Goes without saying. Specticle is pretty safe on wiregrass, Indian grass, broomsedge, and bluestem as long as it's established. If it's not established, it can really thin your stand and cause some issues. Cool season herbicides, tall fescue, Certainty used to be labeled on well-established areas at low rates. It also, Certainty has additional control of sedges. I'm not advising you use Certainty off-label. I think it's curious that they removed cool season grasses, but that was a great product. And to be fair, it probably does have some phytotoxicity issues, especially on mown areas, but in our cool season roughs, it was pretty safe. Almost all mitotic inhibitors, so the barricades, pendulums, dimensions, they're safe on established grass. But if you're relying upon fall distribution, natural propagation of seed from those fescue, yeah, it could thin your stands. That's not always a bad thing, but it's something to contemplate. I don't know why you're putting out pre's in the fall. In cool season scenarios, that's typically when they're at their densest and most competitive. Crabgrass, goosegrass, they're not a problem. I guess you get some fall emergence of some broadleaves, and so maybe that's why you'd use it. Also, keep in mind in our fine and hard and creeping red fescues, we can use segment, which is sethoxydim at low rates. A claim even is tolerated at some rates on some of these fescues. In general, the HPPD inhibitors, those bleachers like Pilex, like Tenacity, they're safe, but efficacy depends upon weed maturity. So if you've got, tillard crabgrass or tillard goosegrass, it gets pretty difficult to control with these herbicides unless you are able to make multiple applications, and so that gets pretty pricey for a low maintenance type of scenario. This is Jared Hoyle's photo. This is in an intermediate rough where you have goosegrass being controlled. This is Pilex controlling goosegrass. That's some pretty large goosegrass. It'd take 2 applications, probably about 28 days apart, to really get good control of that material. Pilex, it has its fit. So does Tenacity in these native cool season as well as cool season fescue types of scenarios. So to summarize herbicides and then think about questions you want to send to Lisa. She's going to shoot those off in just a minute. Pre-herbicides have utility in native roughs, especially spring applications. Spring applications for both native warm season as well as the cool season, because that's typically when you're going to have those competitive annuals, goosegrass, crabgrass, Johnson grass. Arguably, you're not going to get a lot of pre-activity on it. Vassy grass, those grasses that are establishing in the spring, they're really the tricky ones to control for us, and it may differ elsewhere. Applications of non-selective herbicides in combination with the pre should be made to dormant grass only. And so Roundup, great for controlling Johnson grass or Vassy grass as a spot treatment. But if you're putting that over the top of anything that's not dormant, yeah, you're going to have a big hole there, and then you're just going to have more weed invasion. Pre-herbicides may limit seeded establishment and propagation. So something to think about. Lisa, you got any questions I might want to entertain while we just wrap up?
There are 2 here. The first one is, what are your thoughts on Defendor?
Yeah, Defender's a great product in cool season markets. It's safe on warm season markets. There's no reason you can't use it across the board. I don't know that there's been extensive work on native cool season grasses like the wild rise, but my intuition tells me that it would be safe on pretty much every grass. With maybe some random exceptions of carpet grass that we've got in native intermediate rough here in the southeast, I hardly ever see it do any injury to grass species. Like that would also indicate it's not going to control grasses, it's going to control broadleaves. And I'm going to talk about some new material in a minute that has fluoroazulam, the active ingredient in Defender, in it. Spot applications, Lisa, spout them out to me. I'll keep them going.
What about fusilade applications?
Fusilade, it has a label in some scenarios. I'm not sure how confident I would be putting across fine fescue or creeping red fescue. You've got lots of folks that are experts in that. Aaron Patton at Purdue could probably give you a rundown of some of the issues. Eric Watkins at Minnesota, Tony Koski at Colorado, Dave Kopech, all of those guys would have a lot more experience doing that on broad acreage types of scenarios.
Okay, one more. I'm in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas. I'm going to be using...
Oh, wait. If it's about King Ranch bluegrass or bluestem, I got nothing.
No. I'm going to be using freehand around the greens. How will this work in native areas? Freehand's
a good product. I'd be careful on short mown grass, but freehand is a great product for goosegrass control. I don't have any reservations about using it. I would be careful on my greens. Follow the label directions. Make sure you don't have water movement onto those greens and collars.
And he just said follow the label directions, which he said a couple of times. Label is the law.
That's all the
questions we have right now, sir.
Okay. We control spot applications. No one wants to do it. Everybody's got to do it. If you got problematic weeds that can't be controlled any other way other than using non-selectives, then put in a backpack sprayer with Roundup and go out there and do it. Wick applications, like in Lisa Wick. Wick applications are hard work, and they don't always work all that well.
Well, of course they're hard work.
You know, that's nothing against your name. Nothing. Early in the year, they work pretty well. I have seen wick applications with Roundup in this boom work fairly successfully for controlling thistle. I have seen it work fairly well for controlling young saplings, but it is difficult. And if you've got a lot of them, you're better off rethinking what you're doing. But it only controls things above the grass canopy, and that can be tricky in and of itself. So no one herbicide provides complete control of all of our broadleaves. And Jared and I, we always like to remind people there's a reason why the good folks at PBI Gordon, they formulate multiple active ingredients into a broadleaf product. You may get fair control of common chickweed with 2,4-D, but you get excellent control of common dandelion. This general rule of thumb also applies in our native roughs, or our natural areas. So if you're using a single active ingredient material, particularly broadleaf materials, then you're probably going to find not excellent control across the board. There are some newer materials out there. Defender's not new, but I include it just for the conversation. Defender's great on most grasses, and so it's pricey, but it's safe. And if you're using a side-mounted boom sprayer, you can make applications 10, 25, 30 feet up into a native area and control a lot of cool season broadleaves. Now, when you start dealing with some of the warm season broadleaves like Virginia buttonweed, dollarweed, dicamba, it gets harder to control with just that single active ingredient fluorouracil. But our good folks at Dow have introduced a new active ingredient, haloxapine methyl. They call it Aerolex. So you're going to see here in a moment as we go that it's becoming more common to brand a single active ingredient, and then that active ingredient is added to other things. And that's a really good idea. This is safe on warm and cool season grasses. It's got really quick activity. It's really low use rates. And it is in combination, advance slide. It is now in combination with fluorouracil, same active as in Defendor, for control of broadleaf weeds in warm and cool season turf. It acts relatively quickly. It's a very effective herbicide, especially this time of year for our annual broadleaf species. As we get on into the summer, arguably there's a little bit less control than maybe some other products such as metsulfuron on Virginia buttonweed, on dichondra and dollarweed. But again, great product, especially where you have dense canopies where they're suppressing active growth of other weeds. Well, there's also Game On, which is 2,4-D choline. That's low volatility 2,4-D in combination with fluroxapyr. It used to be called Vista by Dow, and it is in Escalade 2 and Battleship 3. It's in combination with haloxapine methyl. It's going to be mainly on cool season turf and zoysia because that fluroxapyr, just like triclopyr, can ding Bermuda grass in a lot of scenarios. Okay, then let's talk about some PBI Gordon materials. So analogous to, I don't want to say analogous, but let's just use the word analogous. Analogous to Game On is Switchblade's haloxapine methyl in combination with fluroxapyr and dicamba. So rather than the low volatility 2,4-D, they've got dicamba, and they got a great product for broadleaves. These are all auxin-mimicking herbicides, but keep in mind, you've got all these active ingredients, and they're all going to have various weeds they control, so you get a much larger, broad spectrum of activity across a number of different broadleaf weeds. They're introducing a new product, which is Fescues. This is pyrimesulfan. It is an ALS inhibitor. It's got some broadleaf and grass activity. Particularly interesting is it's probably going to have some sedge activity on some things like Kalinga. And they're going to have a new granular product that should be available in 2019 that's going to be powered by Fescues, and it's actually going to control a number of different weeds. It's a great delivery mechanism, especially for LCOs. I don't know how much golf course guys are going to adapt that type of granular technology, but they have with other materials. One thing I want to add about pyrimesulfan and pinoxalam. We've done some research with those actives in native warm season grasses and had tolerance. If you have tolerance, that's one thing, but if you are Having crabgrass activity or goosegrass activity, those herbicides don't control them, and so that can be an issue. And so we've had some stands that got away from us, crabgrass and goosegrass got away from us. Weed control in forbs, we're going to wrap up in just a minute, Lisa, I promise, but ultimately if you're trying to maintain a grass-free broadleaf area, you can spray any of our grass selective herbicides like Fusilade, Segment, Acclaim. All of those are going to give you good control of grasses and allow you to have a break or suppress the grass and release the broadleaf species. We've done some work with folks at Georgia, Gerald Henry, and we've looked for activity or safety of a number of different herbicides. Here's our list on different forbs. We had, I think, 9 or 10 forbs, and we get some safety. I want to show you really quickly what we get. Here's an example, non-treated, where we have no injury of all of our different forbs, 8 species. Fusilade's really safe. Anything around that 20% mark's really safe. So Broomsedge or Sedgehammer. Image is fairly safe. An interesting thing about image is it's really common in a lot of our other broadleaf scenarios. Homeowner markets for ornamental weed control in the southeast. This is the #1 product you find on shelves. It's safe on most ornamental broadleaf. So that's why we included it. Something like Lawn Trail, not going to be terribly safe. Tenacity, Bassagran, they've probably got their place, but may cause more injury than we deem necessary. So here's some examples directly showing you what we saw and how we rated these. This is Plains Coreopsis. You can see some diminished, some diminished growth of some of our species. Lisa, I'm going to zoom through these, and then we're going to wrap up and take some questions. There's Indian Blanket. Tall blue cornflower. Okay, final thoughts. Be smart. This is a Mazza pier movement across a Bermuda grass fairway. A Mazza pier is arsenal. It is used for pineland release and control. It is also a soil sterilant. You don't want that on your course. Any of these products can move, so be careful with any of the material you're using. Be realistic. Back up one here. Even native plants don't grow under trees. Well, I mean, there's some exceptions, but, largely, just be realistic. Not everything is going to grow underneath heavy canopy, and so you got to think about that. Communicate with stakeholders. This is a tall fescue rough, mainly tall fescue, at Jackson Country Club. So, Stanley Reedy does a great job prepping his course for the Sanderson Classic, which is in August. This is not what you want in August. And tall fescue looks pretty shabby come August in Mississippi. So you got to think about your material. When's it going to be primed and ready for, the big show? So you got to communicate with stakeholders. Just because fine fescue can look really great in your area at certain times of year, or just because they want something, hire a consultant or an architect to give you some advice if you really are stuck. There's a lot of helpful resources. I got a whole stack of books here. Find local material on Amazon that is for your area. Who knew there was a Wildflowers in Mississippi or of Mississippi? There's probably one of those for every different state. So if you're interested in pollinator habitat or if you're interested in native grasses, there's a number of different books out there. I highly recommend you just ask Ernst Seed to send you a seed catalog. They got a lot of pictures in there. It's very easy to see what the texture and color of grasses are. Also, Roundstone Seed is who we've worked a lot with. They're out of Kentucky, and they have been great supporters of ours. Also, Applewood Seed. That's who has been working with Syngenta Operation Pollinator for their seed source. So there's a lot of great resources, and I'm a resource too if you need to contact me. Really quickly, a couple of folks I want to thank. Thank you, PBI Gordon, for putting on this type of work. Or putting on this type of seminar and for helping us by supporting a lot of work in native grasses. We look forward to doing more work on these types of issues because I think they're increasingly important. I would tell you if you're in the native desert Southwest region, look at Maggie Ryder. Maggie is on Twitter. She has been doing some work for University of California looking at plant selection. I would talk to Dave Kopek if you're in the Arizona area. Dave's information there. Probably Tony Koski is someone that is familiar to most of us. Tony's at Colorado. He's a great resource. There are others. Eric Watkins. Eric is up in the Minnesota area and has done a lot with fine fescues and fescue selection, especially species selection. So there's a number of resources in addition to me that would be glad to help you. Lisa, what do you think?
I think great job.
I'm sorry I went a little over. The questionnaires really got me.
Oh, that's okay. So we want to make sure that people get this code 999-20716-27536. That's your external education code that you can use to record your points. We thank PBI Gordon for making sure that education is available for those points. Anybody watching this recording in the future, make sure you record the date you're listening, not our original date. What about how to control grass weeds in established wildflowers?
Well, wildflower areas, because they're broadleaf forbs, typically, unless there's some sedges in there, you can spray any of the ACC ACE inhibitors. So those FOPs or DIMs, Fusillade, Acclaim, Segment, probably leaving out a bunch of them. There are products out there that are safe on broadleaves, and those ACC ACE inhibitors are my go-to for release of broadleaves.
Okay. I also want to mention that March 20th, Fungicide Rotation Program Development and Implementation, also presented by PBI Gordon and taught by Paul Koch. And someone says, can I read the code again? It is on your screen. Our webcams may be over it, but that code is 999-20716-27536.
Someone had a question about Bassie grass, and I really quickly would add Bassie grass and Johnson grass control can be tricky because if you're in a cool season desirable scenario, you don't have great options. So the safe ACC ACE inhibitors, Segment, Fusillade, they're not going to kill Johnson grass or Bassie grass. If you're in native warm season grasses, the common thing to use is Plateau or a Mazapic. So that's an option. I would add one more note to those 74 of you remaining. Keep in mind, there's a lot of herbicides out there that do a great job of controlling broadleaf weeds that we don't think about and are very cheap. So metsulfuron methyl, MSM turf, is cheap and it's pretty well tolerated on most of our low maintenance areas. Make sure you read the label and follow the label. There's not always a label for some of the natives on our areas. So you got to dig a little deeper. Sometimes you got to look at alternative labels that were labeled long ago for range and pasture and see whether or not you can use MSM or Manor on your particular species. I'd be glad to help with that if anybody's got any questions. I like reading labels.
Okay, good. Label is the law. We thank PBI Gordon. I don't have any other. Do you have any closing remarks for us, Jay? I think we're.
What about Jay Young? Jay Young got anything he wants to say?
No, that's a good point. Let's unmute him. Hang on. Jay Young, you have anything you want to say?
I'd just like to thank the GCSA and Dr. McCurdy for putting this together this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Absolutely proud to do it. I thank everyone for attending. If you need handouts, you can get those from the GoToWebinar control panel real quickly. If your panel has minimized, just click that orange rectangle, and I will stay on the line for just a few moments for those of you who want to do that. Otherwise, we'll see you online again soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye, Lisa.
Bye.